It happened in a small town in the North Carolina, South Carolina area, which is where I'm from. A young boy on a farm, and all they had was an outhouse. They didn't even have a bathroom in their home. And so he was so frustrated with that because as a young man, in the summer, it was hot. And he'd have to go out to this outhouse. Well, in the winter, it was cold. And he said, no matter when I went out there, it stunk. And so he just hated this thing. And he had in his mind, just like little boys do, he formulated a plan in his mind of what he was going to do is one day he would topple this over into the creek right there where it was right beside the creek. He would just knock it over. Well, it wasn't too long before he had his opportunity. Some of you may remember Hurricane Hugo. And Hurricane Hugo came through into the North Carolina area. And this young man, after everything dried up, cleared up, had a chance to go outside and play. Got outside and recognized that with the creek at its very highest level, right at the edge of the bank, that this was his opportunity, his chance. His moment had arrived. So in his excitement, he's looking around and he finds a 2x4. He gets this long 2x4 and he hooks up like he's a knight on a horse and begins to run towards the outhouse, hits it at the top, topples it into the water. As it begins to float away, he suddenly realizes, whoops, maybe that wasn't such a good decision. And so he runs away from it, plays the rest of the day like any little boy, forgets about it like any little boy. And that night he sits down at the dinner table. As he's at the table having his meal, his father looks at him and says, son, when we finish dinner, you and I need to go outside to the shed. Now, the little boy knew exactly what that meant. He was about to get as we say in North Carolina, a whooping. And so he, of course, inquisitively and innocently said, well, why? And his dad looked at him and said, well, son, today someone pushed the outhouse into the creek. And he said, son, I think that someone was you. Was it? His son looks back at him and after thinking for a minute and feeling like he's on the spot, says, yes, sir, it was. His dad said, well, that's the reason we're going to the woodshed. And his son, thinking as fast as he can, how do I get out of this? Like some of our executives. Came up with a plan, right? At the last minute, but a plan. And so what he said was, but Dad, we just studied this fellow named George Washington. He was a president of the United States. And you know what I read was that when he admitted that he chopped down the cherry tree, Father, he wasn't punished. His dad looked back at him and said, yes, son, you're right. But when he chopped down the cherry tree, George Washington's father wasn't in the tree. Now, I want to pull out of that for us three things that I think are important for you and I, because sometimes the simplest message is the one that sticks and the one that works. All right, so first of all, if you've got anything to write on, I'm going to have you write down three things. This will be all I ask you to write down, but I think this is important for you to take with you as you walk out. If you'll just number your paper, 1, 2, 3, three very short things. Number one, something. Number one is something. Number two, effects. Effects. Number three, consequences. Something affects consequences. Now let me flesh that out just a little bit for you. That was just a chance for you to hopefully remember it easily when you walk out and throw the paper out. Something affects consequences. Number one, think of the story. There is something within all of us that causes us to make bad decisions, therefore creating risk. Okay? Number one, something inside of us that compels us to make these bad decisions. Number two, our bad decisions affect other people. And if you'd like, you can say their bad decisions affect other people. Number three, there's always a consequence to those decisions. Pretty simple message. That's it. All right, and it takes me to asking myself this question: am I complete? am I complete? And I started thinking about Barry. I look back in Barry's life, and some of you have some stories I know. I've heard some of them, and we have things that have happened over the years to us, okay? But I remember as a child, one of my first really great memories of my grandparents being down in Pecos, Texas, a little small town in Texas, a border town if you know where it is. Pecos, Texas, in my grandmother's kitchen having lunch. Now, the rule at my grandmother's house was if it's on your plate, you eat it. Okay? Now, what was on my plate was one of my top 3 most hated foods, squash. So there was a big blob of yellow squash on my plate, and I knew I had to eat it. So I am sort of moving it around and doing eating everything else and being slow. And then there's movement in the kitchen. My grandmother's taking care of everyone's needs. She's moving around. She's getting drinks. She's making sure everyone's plate's full. And then, of course, we had to take our plate to the sink. So as my cousins got up and were removing their plates and taking them to the sink, I had an idea. Yes, I did. Something compelled me to make a bad decision, right? And so I decided to scoop the squash off of the plate into my hand and slip it into my pocket. Now I have this nice little wad of squash in my empty plate, and I'm now headed to the sink, dutifully ready to set my plate down because I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to. When my grandmother notices there's a wet spot in my pants, she says, "Son, what is that?" I said, maybe I spilled something. She says, "No, I don't think so." And she starts pushing on it. It's a little squishy. And of course she discovers that it was squash. My being compelled to make a bad decision led me to a consequence. I jumped all the way to number 3, and the consequence was I had to eat every bit of the squash that remained in the pot. That was a 3.5-hour meal. Now, I will tell you that today I love squash, but at the time I hated it. I could not stand it. And you see, at the time I didn't even think number 2 mattered because the only thing I could think about was me. And how many times do our executives, do our leadership, do the people we work with, does your boss think the same way? You see, I thought I was being forced to eat squash. But there's rules and discipline around the things that you and I do that make us successful in our careers, in our business, and in what it is we do for our companies. But I didn't want to follow the rules, and I didn't want to have the discipline. I didn't like the squash. And I wonder how many times, first, you think you're getting squash, and number 2, you pay a consequence, but you forget, actually I should say 3, you pay a consequence, because number 2 is bad decisions affect what? Other people. But see, as an adult, I can look back now and realize that my grandmother was affected by that decision as well. Because my grandmother actually had to stay and monitor and watch Barry for 3.5 hours. But I didn't feel any of that. All I could think of was me. That selfishness gets in our way sometimes, doesn't it? So as I look at that, I fast forward a little bit into my life. Now, some of you, anybody here, someone who ever threw an egg at a car? Just, be honest now. No one's here that would know, right? Did you throw an egg at a car? All right, well, I had some friends that did that, but I'm competitive. I like to do like one better. So I had a bike that I had to repair the tire, and so I had this big, this tube that came out of it. And so I got this idea, that's pretty cool, and I started practicing making a big slingshot between 2 trees with that thing. I could fire off. And then I realized, well, if I used a tire tube that my dad had, if I cut it open, I could turn it into a really big kind of a device there, and we could, man, this is cool. So anyway, just off of the corner of our house, there were some apartments next door, and they had these little low bushes, but they just grew in the perfect little V. Oh, it was wonderful. So we tie it off. Now I've got buddies involved now, right? So we're working this thing, devising the perfect device, and we're practice firing a little bit, and then along comes this little car. Now, throwing an egg wasn't good enough for us. No, sir. We put half a dozen in the launch pad, okay? We've got 6 eggs in there, and we get it all set up, ready, pull it back, ready to fire. Bam! We hit the car perfect. I mean, it's all over the place, right? This is awesome. We're having a great time. Until the car stopped. And out jumped, the junior, soon to be a senior football player for our high school football team, who was like in my head, 320 pounds. He was a really big guy, right? At which point we decided, ruh-roh, we better go. So we were out of here, right? So we take off. Now, I would tell you that my bad decision, right, had a consequence. In that case, it was simply that I ran away. I didn't get caught. Whew. But I will tell you that about 6 months later, he was coming around, and I was not in high school. I was in junior high, but he was in charge of local fraternity, and he came around to pick me up for a party and pulled into my driveway, and the first thing he said was, I remember coming by here and... and I'm like, I wonder who would have done that, right?